Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, or actually good evening in Warsaw, Poland, where I am connecting from. Welcome to the Polish Institute of International Affairs. I'm the head of research at PISM. My name is Patrycja Sasnal. And I did say good afternoon because Tom Wright, who's one of our panelists, is connecting from DC, if I understand correctly, Tom. And Dan Hamilton's connecting from Berlin. We're here for a seminar that is linked with this book, Europe Whole and Free. Just checking if you can see it. The book was out last year, but we are meeting here today to talk about one of the chapters in this book. The chapter's author is Tom Wright. It's the chapter's title, it's After a Europe Whole and Free, and that's why our seminar is also What After a Europe Whole and Free. We're live streaming on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Please make sure you're on the right medium. You can ask questions in those media. If you want to ask question in YouTube, I think you need to have a YouTube channel. Please make sure you type your question in the chat box there. Please ask questions on Facebook and Twitter as well. We'll go to those questions after we have had our conversation with Tom and Dan, which will be in about 30 to 40 minutes. I just want to make sure you know where to find us exactly. So I will now tell you what our address on Twitter and on Facebook is. It's twitter.com/PISM_Poland. And on Facebook, it's facebook.com/PISMPoland. So let me move to introducing and welcoming our panelists. Tom Wright works at the Brookings Institution. He's the director of the Center on the United States and Europe and a senior fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy. He is also a contributing writer for The Atlantic and a non-resident fellow at the Lowy Institute for International Policy. He is the author of a book, the title of which is All Measures Short of War, the Contest for the 21st Century and the Future of American Power, which I hope we will be talking about, the future of American power. The book was released 3 years ago by the Yale University Press. So Tom works on great power competition, Brexit and the future of the EU, economic interdependence, Donald Trump's worldview, and US world policy. Also, I hope we'll be talking about those issues, maybe with the exception of Brexit. Hopefully that topic seems to be done. Dan Hamilton. Dan is the co-editor of the book that we're meeting here for today. But I always find it difficult to introduce Dan because I know I will never do him justice. He is connecting from Berlin because he's the Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy at the moment. That's why he is there. But he is in the first place the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation Professor and Senior Fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute of Johns Hopkins University's Paul Nitze School of Advanced International Studies, where he co-directs the school's postdoctoral program on the United States, Europe, and World Order, together with the school's Henry A. Kissinger Center for Global Affairs. He was founding director of the school's Center for Transatlantic Relations and executive director of the American Consortium on EU Studies. He is also president of the Transatlantic Leadership Network. The network co-published the book with PISM. He has been a senior US diplomat serving as US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, US Coordinator for Southeast European Stabilization, Associate Director of Policy Planning Staff for 2 Secretaries of State. I will just tell you about his recent books. All of them were published last year. The first of which is Exiting. The book shows you the spectrum of his interests, the broad spectrum of his interests. Exiting the Cold War, Entering a New World. Open Door, NATO and Euro-Atlantic Security After the Cold War, Europe Whole and Free, the book that we're here for, and the Transatlantic Economy. Now, before we start our conversation, I just want to tell you that we're happy to announce that now 5 chapters of the book, Europe Whole and Free, are available toll-free on our website, pism.pl. So please do go there and find the chapters. Tom, if you're okay, I want to start with your chapter, just to tell our viewers what it's about and what your thesis there is. So the title is After a Europe Whole and Free. I wonder why that title. Are we already done with liberating and uniting Europe, or is it still work in progress? And in your conclusions, you write this sentence, simply recommitting to a Europe whole and free is not enough. So I wonder whether you still, you would still give your chapter that title.
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you so much for having me on today, and also thank you for having me participate in the book project, which is really interesting and made me sort of think hard about sort of Europe policy. So yeah, you know, I thought it is a bit of a provocative title, but I can sort of explain, I think, sort of the background to it. It just seems to me that 10 or 15 years ago, it was pretty easy for us to say that US policy in Europe was a Europe whole and free, right? And that was also what NATO and the EU was sort of working toward, for all the obvious reasons, with NATO and EU enlargement and the consolidation of democracy throughout Europe, and the strong bond between the US and Europe. But that over the last 10 years, many of those key elements have been called into question and are somewhat problematic, right? So on the European side, we've seen some democratic backsliding in Hungary and elsewhere, Turkey. We've seen the Russian annexation of Crimea and the war against Ukraine. We've seen the Euro crisis with all of the things that sort of set in motion. I think many of which were overcome, but some of those fault lines remain. More recently, since the book was published, obviously we've seen the COVID-19 crisis. Again, I think Europe has sort of responded pretty well to that after a wobbly beginning. But there's a variety of developments, I think, that sort of are real sort of crisis points in Europe's post-Cold War experience that didn't exist maybe in the mid-2000s. Meanwhile, on the American side, we have a president who definitely, I don't think, believes in either the whole or the free part of a Europe whole and free. Now, his administration, some of them do, but he doesn't, so that's not insignificant. I think there is a bit of a tension between the whole and free parts. You see that playing out over Hungary, where some people would say, the US should continue to engage and really work with Orban because it's important to have them in the alliance. And others who would say, well, not so fast, actually, they're no longer really that free. So maybe they shouldn't be as big a part of our Europe agenda. And maybe, it might even call the alliance with Hungary into question, right? So that's sort of a tension that sort of emerged. And so I think it is sort of an appropriate moment to say, since Europe seems to be more divided than maybe we would have hoped it would have been, when sort of freedom and democracy are more questioned, and when the US commitment is more questioned, what should sort of US goals be, and also what should the alliance be working toward? So that's sort of the backdrop, just partly is pointing out that, that this, it's not just enough to say this is our goal, because there have been significant setbacks. The part of this that's proscriptive is that I do think we are seeing great power competition with Russia and China, which is really part of this broader clash of governance systems, right? That we are seeing a authoritarian system which is not universalist. It doesn't seek to impose itself necessarily in every country, but it creates negative externalities in terms of repression and corruption and other things that impact our societies. And it's a very different envisioning of international norms and rolling back of those liberal norms internationally. So we have that system, and then we have an imperfect and sort of somewhat troubled democratic and free society system, which we, Europe and the EU and the US and Japan and others offer. And those two are sort of bumping up against each other. And I think what the US needs to do now is to really focus on that core group of free societies to say, how do we make ourselves more resilient to external pressures? How do we show more solidarity with each other in the face of these challenges that we confront? And then how do we shape that international system? And I think that is a bit of a different way of thinking about it, although not necessarily incompatible with the old sort of policy of whole and free.
Thanks. Dan, if you were to look in retrospect at the book and Tom's chapter, what was it that you found appealing about it?
Well, Tom's outlined, I think, what is, unfortunately, many of the trend lines that we see. It corresponds largely with my own thinking. You know, Europe whole and free was a term that President Bush Sr. used at the very end of the Cold War as a goal for US policy. It informed administrations of both political parties over 30 years. And I think it sums up a sort of a paradigm that most Europeans believed in for 30 years, which is of this magnetic, gradually expanding Western-led order in which other societies that would become free could join across the European continent, that there would be eventually a place for Russia in that order, that the United States would continue as sort of a benign supporter of that order, that the future belonged to civilian powers, the old military threats of the Cold War had vanished, the ethnic tensions had faded away. It was a wonderful view, but that is now a paradigm that is lost to us. And part of the first step to going forward is to understand that we're in a very different situation, in which all the premises, spoken or unspoken, of that paradigm have been challenged. The idea that borders cannot be changed by force in Europe has been challenged by Russia. Ever closer union, the dream of the European Union, has been challenged by the United Kingdom. The idea that more Europe would solve European problems was challenged when waves of migrants came to Europe's shores and Europe had no answer. So there and again, all of these things have changed Europe from being whole and free to fractured and anxious. I'm always struck by Mr. Macron's sort of, slogan that people seem to like, which is a Europe that protects. But the way he implements it, to me, strikes me as it's a Europe, in his vision, that protects some Europeans from other Europeans. That's not much of a vision. It's a very inward-looking focus, and that's the type of Europe we're seeing. And perhaps the greatest shock to our European colleagues is that the three major external powers with which Europe deals, Russia, China, and the United States, under Donald Trump, have all turned revisionist. Each in their own way is seeking to challenge the prevailing order, of which Europe has been the largest beneficiary. And so it's an unfortunate confluence of events and trends, and it's posing real questions for us, which we can discuss if you like.
Sure. I would love to ask Tom about this idea of clash of systems and the sort of black and white vision of what a certain system is, whether it belongs to the liberal democratic order or it belongs to the authoritarian one, because it seems that there might be more of shades of gray in our systems than just black and white. But I want to continue in the vein that Dan started, and this is about intra-European affairs. Actually, your subtitle in your chapter is Europe Rethinks Europe. So I wonder, Tom, how you find the state of intra-European affairs in the context of the pandemic specifically. You mentioned in your chapter two crises that you see as fundamental, formative perhaps for Europe. That's the 2009 Eurozone crisis and the 2015 refugee migration crisis. But actually, you could look at it very differently. Surely there's Brexit, but if you look at the numbers, the support for the EU is at all-time high since it's been counted in early 80s. Despite the pandemic, France and Germany are cooperating again, big time. Germany is rethinking its traditional austerity stance. The conference on the future of Europe may transform into some kind of European constitutional conference. So I wonder how you describe the state of affairs in Europe now.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I would like to come back to the shades of grey point, because I very much agree with that. I want to unpack that in a few minutes.
Tom,
But on, yeah,
Tom, would you agree that we take that when we discuss China? Because I think it fits really well with the Chinese part.
Yeah, no, I'd love, we'll come back to that. Yeah, and I very much agree with Dan's comments. I think Europe has actually done pretty well in the COVID-19 crisis. I think there was a very rocky start when, I spoke to European officials who said, like German officials and others who were despairing about the lack of European coordination or interest in that. And obviously we had a couple of data points early on, the Serbs from the outside, the Italians complaining about the EU. But, what's interesting, as you know, is that turned around fairly quickly, so there was, it took a few weeks, but in the overall scheme of things, that's actually pretty fast. And I think there has been progress on it. And so I think that is encouraging. I do think there's likely to be continuing, major challenges. And I think the problem, there was an old slogan I used to like in the Euro crisis, which is, sometimes it's not enough to do your best, you have to do what's required. And I often felt when you talk to European officials, they would say we're doing our best, we're making this progress, but there is an objective reality out there of a financial crisis and fissures, and the result of not having fiscal union, which didn't really care about best efforts, right? It cared about sort of the vulnerabilities. And I think that still applies, but I think actually, Europe's in a reasonably decent position to deal with that. And I think we should be sort of praising the response thus far. I do think there are some fissures that have sort of opened up, and I think Italy is one of those, and there's long-term questions over, the mutualization of debt and the like, and where this Franco-German deal is going to go. And, there's all sorts of things. I think one thing, though, that we can probably agree on is that there are many more internal fissures today than there were, say, in 2007, 2008, just before the Euro crisis. And that's because of those other events. And I do think that there's probably a relatively low tolerance in Europe for sort of failure to deal with this, right? So if in 2 or 3 years, the perception is that Macron has not actually, succeeded in responding to COVID-19, that may have a real impact. Because a lot of the political capital and that buffer that the center had in 08, 09, that has been attrited over the last decade, that's now largely gone. And so the populist, more nationalistic types, are either in government or on the verge of it. Italy is a good case of that. So I guess what I'm saying is I have been encouraged, but I still think there are big sort of risks just because the underlying conditions are so fragile. That it's that I think it's going to be difficult to respond to this.
Dan, would you like to add anything to that? I mean, you're sitting in Berlin. That's a good place to be these days in Europe. Do you see things more optimistically than what sort of transpired from your introduction?
Well, I don't. I'm sorry. I mean, looking from this privileged position outside of Berlin at the moment, at my own country, I have to say it's quite a spectacle. But what happens in Europe often is Europeans tend to compare their country with the United States, and usually, their country is rather small. The United States is a continent. It's often better to compare Europe to the United States on these kinds of matters. And the fact is, frankly, if you look across Europe, Europe has not fared that well with the pandemic. The casualties, the people who are sick, death rates in absolute numbers rival those of the United States. There are huge problems in some parts of Europe. Others have done rather well. But you could say that for parts of the United States too, actually. So we are dealing with a confluence of other challenges in our country that, particularly on racism and structural systemic racism, that have added to all of this, plus a president who is trying to fan the flames of polarization all at the same time. I don't think you find those dynamics here. in terms of the politics. There's certainly racism and all that in Europe, but it hasn't, exploded like it has in the US. So just on the pandemic, I think on the recession, it's going to be very uneven. It's going to hit some countries much deeper, more deeply, and for a longer period than other countries. So you'll see, despite best efforts, a splitting apart, a tugging at different parts of Europe. Some parts will do well, and others are going to struggle. And their problems will be compounded by the economic impact. And unfortunately, the virus is not going anywhere anytime soon. This is not something where we're going to come out of it. There's no coming out. We are going to live in a time of, radical uncertainty for a number of years. So, for instance, the von der Leyen Commission, basically everything they say is moot because all they're going to do is deal with this disaster. It's going to be crisis management for 5 years. It's not going to be a commission that's able to put some structural underpinnings onto something because they're going to be overwhelmed simply by the sheer magnitude of what they're having to face. That's unfortunately what we're going to have to deal with in Europe at a time when the United States is facing a major decision about which way it wants to go in the world. And that'll have an additional impact on Europe, in 6 months' time.
Right. I want to ask you immediately. So, what's your prescription? I mean, what should have been done that was not? If not, what is being done at the moment in Europe?
In Europe.
Yes.
Well, I think, as Tom said, I think many countries have done the best they can. This is not something that people predicted. So it hit everyone, with the force of an unexpected hurricane. So all things considered, one could say, yes, parts of Europe have done rather well, but other parts have not done well. And as I said, gaps are going to just be hard to manage. So I see efforts to go ahead, but one should, be clear-eyed about the challenges here. The fissures that existed before the pandemic are still there. Some have widened. The fact that Germany has sort of changed its position on how to engage in solidarity with its neighbors is a major change, and we shall see how that develops. So there's some positives here, but as usual, it's a very mixed bag. If you want to add Russia to the picture here, the pandemic, is out of control in Russia. And given the fact of porous borders, one should consider that that's part of Europe. And there's going to be considerable problems emanating from Russia's inability to control the pandemic for the rest of Europe. These are the kinds of things people should look ahead to when they think about, how to manage things. To simply not think, when do we get out of this, but how do we manage our way through it for the next number of years? That's, I think, the time frame of what people anticipate here might be very different than what I'm hearing in sort of media debates and political debates.
Got it. Let's move to what actually Dan already mentioned, the situation in the US and US foreign policy. But Tom, are you an opera fan?
An opera fan?
Yeah.
Opera fan.
Yeah. So maybe you know what I mean. So you're starting your recent article in
opera. Yeah.
Yeah. So you wrote a piece for The Atlantic, the title of which is "We've now entered the final phase of the Trump era," but your first sentence there is, "We are in the Götterdämmerung now, the final phase of the Trump era." Götterdämmerung is the Twilight of the Gods, is the last of the 4 pieces of Richard Wagner's cycle, The Ring. So I wonder who the gods are actually in your Götterdämmerung, because your thesis is that, I mean, I can read it out because I actually think it's a great introduction to your article. But the first phase of Trump was when the adults in the room tried to contain him. The second phase was when things were the time of the hubris. And then now we're in this unraveling the chaos phase. So I wonder who the gods are. Is Trump the god in the Götterdämmerung, or is it the United States? Because it does make a difference. In the opera piece, the ending is that the gods end up consumed by flames. So I wonder who gets up consumed by flames.
Right. They all end up badly off in the end. Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously it predates Wagner too, so I think that there's a different, way of looking at it, not just literally in the opera, but you're exactly right. I mean, the idea is that now, there's actually sort of four phases, I think, to me, in sort of the narrative in the Trump administration. There's the period from January 20th, 2017 to about August of 2017, where you have sort of the major, access of adults that's far from perfect, but does sort of constrain his choices. There's formal meetings in the Situation Room. They present a limited number of options to Trump. And by around late July, August, he gets totally frustrated with that over two things. One, the Iran JCPOA, where he's given no option to leave, and then Afghanistan, where McMaster sort of browbeats him into staying. And from that point forward, he begins to get rid of those constraints and to sort of push back. And that begins with, he gets rid of Tillerson, brings in Pompeo, gets rid of McMaster, obviously brings in Bolton, ultimately gets rid of Mattis in December. But that period, then he just really acts as he wants. And he's increasingly just wants people who will say yes, not people who will stand up to him. There is sort of a third phase then where, after doing what he wants, he begins to bump up against his own contradictions. I think in Iran, where he almost went to war despite wanting to do a deal, China, you begin to see these contradictions bubble up. And then the fourth, and I think final phase, although obviously if he's reelected, that phase could go on for some time, or maybe there'll be another iteration of it. But now I think we have the crisis arriving. He really doesn't know what to do in response to the health crisis or the economic crisis, or now the racial tensions that are dominating the news and are very prominent over here. And so he's just grasping out for eye-catching moves that make him appear like a man of action, but really just causes general deterioration, right? And so in the piece, I sort of dissected it on one relatively small issue, which is to do with Hong Kong and the G7 and China, how he basically undermined his own administration's policy that showed signs of working, actually. But more broadly, I think it's all political. He's just sort of lashing out. And we're in for a very rocky sort of 6 months. And my view is, I think he is pretty much done politically. I know no one wants to say that because of 2016, and everyone feels sort of, whiplash from that. And also there's always a chance he could win. But I just think that he's going to struggle because of the depth of the recession that's likely to be protracted, and because he doesn't really have sort of clear answers to any of this, and because Biden is sort of is an acceptable alternative for many people. But if he were to win, I do agree with what Dan was alluding to earlier. I think then European-US relations are on a fundamentally different path. And I think we do have to then wonder if NATO will actually survive in a second term. If the US will remain engaged, I think he will be emboldened and empowered. And I think then it is a very different world in that eventuality.
Mm-hmm. Dan, I wonder what your opinion is. Half a year ago, it seemed as if Trump had the better chance of being re-elected than the Democratic candidate. And now with what's happening after the murder of George Floyd, it seems that the wind is taken from his sails.
Yes, I think so. Although, again, there's a lot of time in politics between now and November. I think for our European friends who are looking on, it's always important in our system to understand our electoral college and how the system really works, that on that election day, it's 50 different elections happening all at the same time, not one election. So public opinion polls and these types of things are interesting to look at, but they don't really tell you too much about what might happen. If the election was held today, based on electoral college sort of tendencies, the Democrats would win. But neither of them right now, neither party has enough to be sure of that victory. So it really does come down to what people say, these battleground states, a number of states, about 6 or 7, where it's still questionable who might have the lead. Of course, you don't want to lose any states you think is your base, and that's maybe part of Trump's challenge now. He might lose some states. So that opens up opportunities for Biden, and one has to really believe Joe Biden is the leading candidate to be president right now. And at the expense of going into some detail for our European friends, but I think often our European friends don't pay attention to some of these states. In Wisconsin, that is a key battleground state which Hillary Clinton lost mainly because of turnout, that on election day, Black voters did not get up in the morning and go vote. She could have easily won. They didn't vote for her. If the fury that we see in the United States continues, they're going to vote. And that'll make a difference in Wisconsin. In Michigan, which is another key state, the old battle was about trade issues. That's Detroit. The battles then were about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and Donald Trump capitalized on that. Now it's about his inability to deal with the pandemic and trying to whip up, protests against a health emergency. And he's trailing now in Michigan by, I think, 10 points. And the other key battleground state is Pennsylvania, which is where Joe Biden was born. Joe Biden is basically from Pennsylvania. He's been a senator from Delaware, but that's the neighboring state. In the media market was Philadelphia. And it's an interesting, very mixed state with energy industries, but also very innovative biotech and other industries, big cities, and a lot of countryside. I believe in the end, Pennsylvania will probably decide the election. And so instead of looking at big trends, it's important in our election to look at some of these details to see what will happen. And at the moment, Joe Biden's leading in all 3 of those states that I mentioned. So we shall see. I mean, if you say, what should we do then? If I would pivot to a Biden administration, he will affirm right away the value of the alliance. He will affirm right away U.S. commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement. He would affirm right away the need for the U.S. and Europe and other open societies, the kinds of societies Tom has been talking about, to build a new coalition to stand up to authoritarian power. These were all things that would happen immediately. But he will be pressed because of the pandemic and the economic recession to also look at priorities at home. So just because Biden might win doesn't mean Europe is off the hook. In fact, American expectations of Europe might be higher. In fact, I'm sure they will be higher under a Biden administration than under a Trump administration. The Trump administration doesn't expect much from Europe. It doesn't really pay much attention to it. Biden will pay a lot of attention to Europe, but he'll expect more from it. And that could be just as troublesome for many Europeans as dealing with the antics of Mr. Trump.
It may be an incitement at the same time. If you expect a lot from someone else, it may be good. So Tom, I wanted to ask you and Dan, but Dan answered that question already. In what way would a Biden administration be different from the Trump one? Surely one might answer in everything, but I mean the 3 main points that you would draw. And please include finally China in there, because I want to move to China at some point. That seems to be a theme that will continue, whatever the future administration, don't you think?
Yeah, no, I'll answer that question, but I think another way of asking it, which is also just interesting as a thought experiment, is how would a Biden administration be different to Obama? Like, what are the differences that Democrats will have compared to where they left off the last time? Because I think that, the differences with Trump are fairly clear cut. As Dan was saying, I mean, Biden will be in favor of the EU and will want to work work with the EU. He'll be in favor of NATO. I don't necessarily think he's going to go back to TTIP, right? But I think there will be a trade agenda, and his instincts will be more multilateral and more sort of pro, the open sort of global economy in that regard. And I think he'll want to work on climate and transnational problems, that he won't see the EU as a competitor in any of that. So I think all of that is sort of the baseline, right? That's just, as Dan was saying, you can sort of take that to the bank at the beginning, right? That's where they'll come. The question, I think, is, is that sort of what we're going to do, as a country, just go back to the way it was, or will there be major sort of changes? And I don't think that they know necessarily yet the answer to that question. But my own personal view is that they should have a more expansive sort of view of Europe policy. So to me, I would rethink the whole burden sharing argument and try to come up with new ways to conceptualize that. I think I would be sort of tougher on sort of the democratic institutions and protecting democracy in Europe. So I think that will be sort of a second piece of it. And then I think there needs to be a broad agenda for including the EU in the US sort of response to China, right? And I think there's a number of ways to do that. But for instance, on TTIP, I would move beyond that and actually try to have a conversation about the broader set of global economic issues that were left out of TTIP that pertain to the economic environment we're in at the moment, with sort of Made in China 2025 and all of these challenges coming from Beijing.
Right. So on China, should we expect a change if Biden forms an administration, or as you seem to be saying in what you write, Tom, and as far as I was able to infer from your texts, there will be a continuation, but maybe with a different style. How do you see it?
Yeah, I think the honest answer to the question again is I don't think we know for sure, just analytically, in terms of where they all come out. I think it depends who the cabinet is, and some of this is personnel. But I think more broadly, I think that we are likely, the area where Biden will be most different to Obama, I think, is on China. I think you will see a more competitive approach, because that's where the party was headed after Obama anyway. Clinton would have been there had she won. And it's also where the country has gone, and it's where Congress is. And so I think there will be a shift. The degree of that shift and the way in which it's described, I think, partly depends on Biden's own choices in terms of policy and people. And I think you could sort of see it going in either, direction. But my preference will be for, a policy that would be more competitive, but would maybe nest it in a larger positive vision, right? So for me, that's more about this idea of the free world and defending that and making it resilient and working with others on common problems. That's a way of nesting the great power competition with China in a more positive vision. For others, it might be to do with defending democracy or something else. But I think we're likely to see that values piece of it come in much more under a Biden administration, because that's something that Trump was basically incapable or unwilling to do. Now, people in his administration very much wanted to do that, but he has no interest in it. And so that's probably the largest gap. And that's one I think that will be sort of very much addressed in terms of China policy and Russia policy as well.
Mm-hmm. So finally, before we go to questions, could you expand, you, Tom, but also Dan, I would love to know your thoughts on that, this notion of the clash of systems, and what I mentioned, that perhaps there are shades of gray and we cannot just have two camps, but there's something wrong with our own house.
Right. Yeah, and I can start on that just very quickly to clarify. I mean, I totally agree, right? I think when I describe these systems, in a way, both of them are present in our own society, right? We have illiberal forces. I think Trump represents that. I think he does have authoritarian impulses. Like he is not an external actor, right? He is an internal actor from within. And we see the same in many other countries. And in authoritarian countries, we sometimes see liberal forces, right? So it's not that each country sort of easily slots into one camp or the other. This, in a way, is an internal challenge as much as it's an external challenge. And for me, talking about it is a way to say, yes, we need to get our own house in order. But when people say that, usually they're talking about it in terms of one country. Like Americans say, we have to fix America before really worrying about the rest of the world. But the problems the US has are not unique to America, right? I mean, they're problems that many free societies have. And so what I'm, saying in this piece and in other pieces is, the US needs to work with other free societies to tackle our shared problems, some of which are structural, right? They're to do with automation and the changing nature of work, or populism, the changing nature of information and news, external problems like interference from China or Russia or others. So there's a big internal resilience dimension to this, as well as sort of the foreign policy piece. But I totally agree, it's not sort of a Manichaean thing of the world's divided up. And in the end, each system will have to work to some extent with each other as well, which is a big piece of it too. But I think we just can't forget that, we do need to do more with like-minded countries. And there is something special about alliances between democratic countries that distinguishes them from alliances between non-democracies or a democracy and a non-democracy.
Mm-hmm. Dan, you said just a couple of minutes ago that this system that we had for 30 years is now shaken. The foundations of it are shaken. So I wonder what you recommend. Should we also think about, in terms of values, think about camps, that we have a camp that espouses liberal values and the other camp in which China and Russia does not, and it's a dual competition, or is it more complicated?
Well, I think back to the sort of theme of our book. At that time, when the Cold War ended, the walls came down, we were in a rather expansive mood. The people of Poland and all of the countries of Central Europe said, we want to rejoin Europe and be part of the civilization we'd always been part of, except for where the Red Army happened to stop in the summer of 1945. And so we helped to open our doors and help that space expand. It tapped into a tradition in the United States of what we would call Wilsonianism. That is, we crusade for democracy. We go out and spread democracy. I think the last number of years, we've been in the opposite position. We have all turned inward. It's a surly, sort of snarly type of society that we're finding ourselves in, and across Europe, across the United States, many other societies. We've turned inward. We're not expansive at all. We're withdrawing from each other, and we're taking a step back. So it seems to me, to pick up on Tom's point, what we need to do is build resilient democracies. We need to, it's not about expansion. It's not a Wilsonian crusade, but it's also not inward. It's not stepping away. It's simply building democracies that are resilient to all of the disruptions of our modern world, whether those are viruses or authoritarian assaults, whether it's dependencies of the supply chains that we have built, or whether it's intrusion through cyber hackers or internet trolls. I think we're in a phase in which resilient democracy becomes a uniting theme, because it allows us to address our own internal failings while we join in common cause with other democracies. It doesn't mean preaching. It means some humility. The biggest damage to democracy in the democratic world is occurring in the United States. So it's very hard for us at the moment to be preaching to others about what they should do, it seems to me. And under President Biden, it'll still take some time for us to recover from all the damage we have wrought because of that. So I think the impulse, I might disagree a bit with Tom, I think the impulse of a Biden administration will be to try to show and lead by example that it's more a Jeffersonian tradition. That's what he has in common actually with Obama. that the way you influence the affairs of the world is not to crusade for democracy abroad, but to try to better it at home. And we have some work to do, as is clear. And I think that'll be much more a frame by which Biden will speak not only to the United States, but to the world. And I think it's just a different type of engagement. It means, positioning ourselves for the future. It doesn't mean launching headlong some expansionist thing. It doesn't mean creating camps, but it means responding to where that resilience is threatened through disruption or challenges to the structural underpinnings of our systems. I think that's much more where I would find the next period going.
Thanks. So we'll move to questions now. I encourage our viewers to ask questions to our panelists. There are so many issues that we haven't covered: Russia, JCPOA, transatlantic relations to some extent, but the state of NATO for sure not. So I'll read out the first question, which is from Slavomir Dembski, the director of PISM. One of the interpretations of what is currently going on in the US is that there is a cultural war going on. Part of the American society does not think USA is the champion of propagating freedoms anymore. They think USA is more about enslavement and aggression. So if people thinking that the US is the example of enslavement and aggression win the war, what will be the outcome of American foreign policy? Will the US still be the leader of the free world? How does NATO fit into such a scenario? Who wants to go first? Tom's unmuted. Tom, go ahead.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so this pertains a little bit to Dan's comment too, which, I think we agree on maybe 90% of everything so far, but we might have a little bit of a disagreement, on this. I think there's obviously a domestic crisis here that has sort of deep roots, right? And I think there is a strong recognition, particularly from Democrats, that there needs to be a very ambitious program of domestic reform on multiple areas, including, on systemic racism, but also economically, on infrastructure. And I think the impulse is to try to go big. I think Biden might have been seeing himself more as a transitional figure maybe a couple of years ago. But, crises, including this and COVID-19, I think have really demonstrated that, this moment that he takes on, if he does win, and will be one that demands sort of big action. Now, the question I think in part is, if you have that, do you then sort of do less abroad, right? Do you try to maybe be a little more humble or a little bit more restrained internationally? I think that's a debate that's sort of ongoing, and we don't really know how it comes out yet. But I would just sort of question whether or not, that's going to be enough, right? Because actually internationally, and our domestic problems are sort of have international aspects too. It seems to me that the demand signal is for very big and bold action, right? And that doesn't mean trying to bring democracy to Iraq or Iran or anything like that. And I actually think we should do less in the Middle East, but it does mean on climate and pandemics, on China, on the nature of democracy, on globalization. I think you could make an argument that foreign policy has to be transformative and maybe very ambitious. And more on sort of steroids than it was before in terms of what the US tries to accomplish. They may be different types of issues, right? I totally agree. It's not about exporting democracy to sort of rogue states or other states that don't want it. But I do think that there is a view that will be necessary. And I don't really think, to be honest, that that people who point out domestic problems necessarily mean that the US can't stand for those values internationally, right? I think actually, if you have an administration that's committed to those values at home, they sort of have to stand for that internationally, because those values are threatened today internationally, as like they're they're threatened in Europe, they're threatened in Asia, in the US, and globally. And I think it is incumbent upon the United States to sort of step up and to sort of lead in that regard with Europe and with, Japan, Australia, and other sort of like-minded democracies.
Mm-hmm. Dan, would you want to answer that question?
I would say again, if it's a Biden administration, Joe Biden is a coalition builder. He knows how to build coalitions across different views and values and lines. And I think that would be his instinct on all of these challenges that we're talking about. Internationally, it means going back to basic coalitions and institutions that we have and make them work. Many of them are dysfunctional, if we're honest. And so it is that would be his instinct, I think, is to gather the forces. We would say in the Wild West, gather your horses, because that's how you deal with many of these challenges. He would share a tough approach on China, as Tom said. I think he would build a coalition, though, to address it. He would try to, not only restore NATO vitality, but have it look ahead. Just practically speaking, NATO will have to revise its strategic concept next year, and that was the first major European task for a Biden administration or a Trump administration. So that's something one has to think about. NATO's future, if you read the current strategic concept, it's way out of date. So there are practical things that will start to shape this in the first 100 days of any administration. If Trump wins again, I agree with Tom. I think many Europeans viewed the Trump election as sort of a blip that the Americans said well, they made this choice. Okay, fine. We'll kind of ride it out. But if the United States re-elects Donald Trump, I think many Europeans will think we have made a strategic decision to go another way. And there will be lots of consequences in Europe for that. I think you'll see a huge return of sort of bilateralism. And if I might say, I think Poland will probably be at the head of the line in terms of securing its relationship with Washington. So I think that's not a bright future for Europe. It returns us to a Europe that we thought we had vanquished. But it's just as plausible as us coming together and building these coalitions. That's why we're in this time of radical uncertainty. We really don't know which way it's going to go.
So can I draw you out a little bit about what you said about Biden's possible attitude towards Europe? And you said it would perhaps not be welcome by some European countries, that he would expect more from Europe. So which countries did you mean, and what exactly would Biden expect?
Well, I think there's a debate in the United States. And I think the question, you can make it very, very, very basic. Do you think Europe is stable, or do you think it's fragile? And we have a different opinion in our country about that question. I think many on the right and many on the left, in fact, believe Europe is stable enough that it should take care of most of its own challenges. It's rich enough, it's mature enough that it has to deal with its own issues and quit depending on the United States for that. That's an America that would be a power in Europe, but it would not be a European power. There's others, Americans, who think that Europe remains very fragile. I'm one of those. I explained earlier why I thought so. And at the root of that is the belief that, unfortunately, the United States, despite maybe our proclivities, has to remain a European power that is comprehensively engaged in the affairs of this continent, both for good and bad reasons. The good reasons are that's in our own interests, that we prosper when our allies prosper. The bad is that it doesn't seem that Europeans can master their own conflicts. And the United States provides a sort of undertone of reassurance for some Europeans vis-a-vis other Europeans. Nobody talks about that a whole lot, but I think it's a very important element of stability in Europe. I believe Joe Biden would lean toward what I've just said, but many in the party and many perhaps in his administration think differently, think it's time, given all the huge challenges we have, the challenges of other parts of the world, that Europe has to simply do more for itself. And I think that's the debate really that we're having that maybe doesn't come across in Europe because everyone's so fixated on Donald Trump. I must say I have to leave because this is an hour show and I really have another appointment. I'm sorry I have to bail out if this is going longer, but I was understood it was an hour. So
Sure.
I really do have to go.
Sure. We just have one more minute. So this is exactly the moment we'll be finishing if you can just stay for 30 more seconds. So Tom, if you have just some very last comments and we'll end.
No, I'll leave it there, I think, especially given Dan's sort of constraints, but this is a terrific conversation. Thank you so much. And I encourage everyone to buy the book.
Oh, thanks. I want to thank you too, Tom and Dan, and thank our viewers for joining us today. I just want to remind you that it's a series of conversations. This was the second one with authors of chapters in the book. There are many. And we invite you to future conversations. Please stay tuned. PISM, Poland. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.